Straight.
Thank you very much. Yes, the next witness is Will Quince.
I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much for coming to help us, Mr. Quince.
Pleasure.
Now, you are Will Quince, is that right? Former Parliamentary Under Secretary of State for Welfare Delivery.
Correct.
Thank you. And you've produced a signed statement to the inquiry dated the 20th of October of this year.
Yes.
And can you confirm that that is true?
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Quince, there's quite a lot of ground to cover this afternoon, and I'm going to try and focus my questions under 6 broad headings, and what I'll do is I'll let you know when I'm moving from one to another, so you know the focus. But I'll give you them now, and so you know where we're going. First, we're going to look at joint working between the Department of Work and Pensions and the Treasury in particular. Second, the overall Department of Work and Pensions strategy for supporting economically vulnerable people and alleviating hardship. Third, the decision to uplift universal credit and working tax credit by £20 per week. Fourth, fraud and error arising from easements that were applied to the application process. Fifth, to look at some considerations relating to long COVID and how they were taken into account by the department. And then finally, I'm going to ask you, Mr. Quince, to help the inquiry with some reflections looking ahead to any future civil emergency. If you want me to repeat anything or break anything down as we proceed, please do let me know. And as you know, documents will from time to time come up on the screen, and I'll give you an opportunity to look at those documents if I'm asking you something that arises from them. So the first topic then, joint working between the Department of Work and Pensions and the Treasury. And I think you observe in your statement that generally relations and working relationships between the department and the Treasury were good during the pandemic. Is that right?
Yes, I think so, yes.
You described there as being a chain of communication and collaboration between the two departments. Is that right?
Yes.
And is this a fair way of looking at it? The Treasury was often setting policy, and the department was sometimes responsible then for delivery of that policy.
Yeah, I think that's Milady, that's a fair reflection. I think when there is a departmental budget, largely departments are left to get on with operational delivery. In the case of very large spend outside of a department's DEL or revenue budget, then Treasury will often set the policy and have very tight guidelines on exactly how that money is to be spent.
Yeah, thank you. The inquiries heard evidence about a policy partnership, or received evidence, I should say, about a policy partnership that has existed between the Treasury and HMRC since 2005. So that's a long-standing formal arrangement. You're aware of that policy partnership between the Treasury and HMRC?
Only having read about it, but
right.
No direct experience thereof.
Okay. But the purpose of that is to join up policy with delivery. Do you understand that there was any attempt by the Treasury or the Department of Work and Pensions to establish a similar policy partnership during the pandemic?
Not to my understanding, no, milady, but I think it was a very fast-paced, dynamic, almost arguably kinetic environment, which meant if indeed that did exist, and I'm not aware of it having done, I think it would have been informal and at Secretary of State to Treasury and to Number 10's office directly, or involving special advisors.
Okay. So essentially, the need for delivery at pace meant that things were happening informally rather than through some formal arrangement that needed to be stood up.
Well, by informal, I
don't mean there's an informality to what was happening.
There is very much a formality, but I suspect it was more the case that it was official to official level, DWP to HMRC, likewise with Number 10, as opposed to the more lengthy weeks or months in which you would ordinarily go through the policy formation process.
Looking ahead, do you think there is any benefit in seeking to develop a formal policy partnership between the Treasury and the Department of Work and Pensions for any future emergency?
I think if that doesn't exist already, then it would certainly be a positive thing. I think in the case of the UC uplift, it was a matter of days in which we had to develop from initial concept to policy and then delivery. So I think having something well established in advance could only be a benefit.
In your experience of being in the department and working with the Treasury, are there any obvious barriers to establishing that sort of partnership?
So I don't think so, but I think just for context, as the most junior minister in the department, I wouldn't have been exposed to partnership at that kind of level. It would have been Secretary of State's office directly to the Chancellor's office and likewise to the Prime Minister's office at Number 10. It wouldn't ordinarily be parliamentary under Secretary of State's that would have that kind of direct relationship with Treasury or indeed with Number 10.
All right, thank you. Well, that completes the first topic. So second topic, whether there was an overall strategy in the Department for Work and Pensions for supporting the economically vulnerable and alleviating hardship during the pandemic. So far as you're concerned, was there any explicit strategy that the department had to support the economically vulnerable and or alleviate hardship?
So the first was, of course, universal credit, our primary benefits system, but also the legacy benefit system that worked in tandem alongside it. And then alongside that also, the other measures which we knew were really important to those who were economically vulnerable, in particular, for example, Lady Rent, so increasing the local housing allowance, putting an extra £1 billion to raise that up to the 30th percentile of local rents, discretionary housing payments. And then as we progressed in those early months of 2020, identifying that there were people who were not necessarily going to get the support through universal credit or legacy benefits, either through eligibility or just needing additional support. And that's why we looked at the COVID Winter Grant Scheme, and then that morphed into the Household Support Fund, which is still in existence today.
Thank you. But those are all undoubtedly things that the department was doing throughout the pandemic to support people and to help people and to try and alleviate hardship. What I was more interested in is whether there was a formal strategy, so a formal, considered, holistic strategy to do all of those things, or is it the case that things were moving at pace and these schemes were developing as the need for them was identified?
So yes, it was a bit of the latter, but I think it was also a case of the primary function of the department was to make sure that we absolutely kept the show on the road. And what I mean by that is making sure that the systems continued to function and function well, and that we were ensuring that those who were claiming benefits, and we were facing unprecedented demand, were paid in full and on time, and that the system, in terms of capability and capacity, was able to cope with that unprecedented demand, because we knew that there were people in desperate need and therefore needed that money and needed it in a timely fashion, and making sure that it's accurate so people are getting the support that they needed.
Thank you. You list a lot of the things you've touched on. You've listed in paragraph 46 of your statement, and you reference there the fact that you were part of what you describe as a cross-government junior ministerial task force, which pushed our respective secretaries of state and the Treasury for the creation of these schemes as an additional safety net for vulnerable groups, families, children, older people. That cross-government junior ministerial task force, was that something that existed formally or informally by communication between ministers in different departments?
No, so that was a formal creation, milady, set up by junior ministers. I can't recall exactly who requested the set-up initially, but it was, I remember Minister Prentice, who I believe was at DEFRA at the time, and it was a number of ministers that were looking at those who are economically vulnerable and seeing who needed additional support over and above the support the government had already given. And those junior ministers and I think exhibited to my witness statement are a number of minutes from those task force meetings where we looked at a number of measures that each department could do to support those vulnerable and disadvantaged individuals and groups. And it was on the back of that the COVID Winter Grant Scheme conceptually was created and then morphed into later the Household Support Fund.
You can't remember who set it up. I mean, you described yourself earlier as being, a junior minister in the department. For a task force like that to have clout, if you like, was this coming from a Secretary of State, from higher up in government, or was this an arrangement that junior ministers decided to take it upon themselves to set up to try and have some joined-up thinking?
This was, as I recall, junior minister-led, which is not normal actually in terms of the way these things work. And in terms of involvement, I remember Minister Ford, Minister Prentice, Minister Churchill, of all the relevant departments that had areas that had responsibilities for looking after support for vulnerable and disadvantaged groups. But we did each individually have the backing of our respective Secretaries of State, and we also had Treasury attending those meetings also, which was important because ultimately there would be a financial ask alongside the recommendations of the task force.
Accepting that sometimes too much formality can slow things down and choke innovative thinking. Do you think there is a case looking ahead for that sort of cross-departmental task force to be stood up in a future emergency? I mean, was it just chance that these junior ministers got on and did work together, or?
I think there was an element of chance in that you had some like-minded individuals, milady, that all shared the same concern about people slipping through the net, and that there being an additional net, if you like, for those who might need that additional support. But the fact that every government department that had responsibility in this area did get involved, and so I think the answer to your question is yes. I think it could only be a positive thing to have junior ministers who are the ones more likely to be having those meetings with stakeholders and charities and organisations that advocate for and represent vulnerable groups, that direct link, meeting and discussing, because often the stakeholders are shared across different government departments, how they can work together to pitch things to Treasury which aren't necessarily one of the burning platforms of their respective Secretaries of State.
Thank you very much. In terms of DWP strategy, leaving aside the grants that you've already described, is it a fair observation from your statement and from the other evidence the inquiry's received to say that at the heart of DWP strategy was to provide this uplifting to universal credit and working tax credit, because it was, from the department's perspective, really the simplest and quickest way of getting support out?
Well, I mean, there's certainly truth in what you say, in that time was really short, and we knew that there was an impending lockdown. The Chancellor wanted to make an announcement about financial support to provide reassurance, and we had to look at measures that were deliverable, which is the first thing, in a relatively short time frame, but also that were operationally deliverable based on the systems that we had at the time, and that were simple, that were easy to understand, and that would make sure that the intended beneficiaries, so the policy intent, the rationale, that it was met. And that's why I think although ultimately it wasn't my decision, but I supported it, why the uplift to the standard allowance by £20 a week was chosen.
Thank you. Mr. Quince, not a criticism at all, and it will undoubtedly be my fault for asking you questions in a way that mean you're talking quite quickly. So if you could just slow down a bit. There's a stenographer who's keeping the note. They need to keep up. And I'll be in trouble if you keep speaking too quickly. So if you could just slow down a bit, that would be great. Thank you very much. Can I just pick up on something else forward-looking again before we move on to the next topic? Lady Coffey, who was the Secretary of State at the time, and I'll obviously ask her about this in due course, has suggested that a valuable tool in a future emergency might be the ability of the department to issue hardship grants, which was a power it used to have and then had lost. Where does that, as a suggestion, sit with you?
I think that might be handy. That might be helpful. Not wanting to disagree with my former Secretary of State, I think it did still exist, but it was transferred to local government and it wasn't ring-fenced. And that's why we explored and then introduced the COVID Winter Grant Scheme and the Household Support Fund. So in effect, it was a DWP function that was then moved to local government, but because of changes in local government funding, it wasn't ring-fenced and different local. It was inconsistent across the. So I'm going to slow down. Sorry, inconsistent around the country as to local authorities as to who had hardship grants and what they were able to give out. So I think they are useful, whether it's the Department for Work and Pensions or whether it's local government. I actually think the Household Support Fund is a good model because I think that local authorities often are best placed to identify the unmet need within their communities because they are at the grassroots, they're at the coalface, they work with those organisations that are supporting the most disadvantaged and vulnerable. So that would be my only concern about it being a DWP function. Having said that, having the Household Support Fund via local government and the ability to make a similar grant as necessary in the case of a national emergency or civic emergency by the department would undoubtedly be a helpful tool.
So as an additional level of power, not in place of that ability of local authorities to administer that sort of support.
Yes.
Thank you. So, third topic then, please. The decision to uplift universal credit and working tax credit by £20 per week. Now, this is obviously quite a significant area of questioning. And so I'm going to break it down again, and then I'll tell you where we're going in terms of working through this topic. First, I would just want to ask you some questions about the origin of the uplift. Second, the policy objective of the uplift. Third, the policy design of the uplift. Fourth, how effective implementation of the policy was. Fifth, the extension, the decision to extend from April of 2021. Sixth, the end of the uplift in October of 2021. And then seventh and finally, monitoring and evaluation of the policy. So we'll try and work through this topic under those subheadings, if we may. And that begins with the origin of the uplift. So just to understand really universal credit. Universal credit, as the inquiry understands it, is a benefit that can be claimed if an individual or household is on a low income or needs help with living costs. That could be because somebody is out of work, or indeed people are working but in self-employed or part-time low-paid employment. Is that right?
That is right, yeah.
Or because people are unable to work because they have a health condition, for example.
Yes.
And the award of universal credit has a standard allowance that's paid according to age and household unit. Is that right?
That's right.
And then there are additional helps with housing costs and so on, and additional elements that can be paid to groups recognised as needing extra support.
Yes, so child disability, for example, housing.
Yeah, parents, disabled people, carers, those. Yeah, okay. And I'm just going to ask, please, if we can have on the screen INQ 000655 and I'll ask that. There we are. Thank you. So this just gives us a bit of context. This is from the statement of Neil Cooling, who was responsible, effectively, as the responsible owner for Universal Credit. Is that right?
That is, yes.
Yeah. There were 2.8 million people claiming Universal Credit before the pandemic, and in the first 4 weeks following the first lockdown, we see the number of people claiming increased by about 40%. So that's about 1.2 million additional claims over the course of 4 weeks. And by the 9th of July 2020, there were 5.6 million people on Universal Credit. So that's an additional 2.8 million. So 100% increase in claims. And then the next paragraph sets out the volume, which I know you've touched on, it is a relevant consideration, the volume of claims and the processing ability of the department. But just looking at that, volume of new claims peaked in March 2020 at nearly 1.4 million declarations in that month. Is that right?
That's my understanding, yes.
Yeah. Compared to 270,000 in March of the following year, 260,000 in March of 2022. And his statement sets out that in a typical normal pre-pandemic week, about 10,000 new claims a day. But in one night, on the 26th of March 2020, there were 136,000 new claims that had to be dealt with. And he sets out in his statement that's a good example of the challenge. So that's the benefit. That's the challenge that the department was facing in terms of the number of applications at the start of the pandemic. Does that give a fair picture of the?
It does, and maybe I sort of inarticulately and rather clumsily sort of was just trying to describe this earlier, but I think I can't downplay enough. I think it's hard to sort of put into how much of the bandwidth within the department was just keeping these systems running, and our main concern as ministers within the department is we've got to make sure that people are in desperate need. They've got to be paid the claims that if somebody's making a claim to Universal Credit, it's because they often have exhausted other options and they are in desperate need. And our clear instruction to officials, well, we've got to make sure that this system delivers for people, that they get paid in full and on time. And no doubt Baroness Coffey will cover this, but I'm really proud actually of the work that the departmental officials did to keep that system running and operational. And throughout the pandemic, we had 93 or 94% of people paid in full and on time. Now that's still 7% that weren't, but it's actually higher than pre-pandemic levels. And the department really rose to the challenge. But one more point to add, Lady, if I may. is just...
A bit more slowly, if please.
Apologies.
Yeah, thank you.
I recall one particular weekend around this period, and I can't give you the exact date, but I remember a call from, and I suspect the former Secretary of State will too, from the Permanent Secretary or Neil Cooling, or perhaps even both, saying that there was a serious risk over that weekend that the system was going to fall over and we might have to do something called a forced stop. And the reason you would do a forced stop is a forced stop is far safer for the system than a system collapse. If the system collapses, you are really in trouble because it takes time to then reboot it. People don't get their payments in time. Now, luckily, coders, the team, Neil Cooling's team worked through the weekend and it didn't come to it. But I think it's just important context for how much of the department's bandwidth, time, energy and resource was put into just keeping these systems going, both legacy and indeed universal credit, given the unprecedented claims, to just make sure that our key thing, when you talked about the strategy was making sure that people got their benefit claims in full and on time.
Taking the figures from Neil Cooling's statement we've looked at, I think the point you're making is had the system collapsed, then at peak there would be 5.6 million people dependent on that money for their basic financial survival who would be deprived of it.
Correct. And I was listening to Malaysia opening statements yesterday, and when we talk about, operations, what we're really talking about is payments. And if that doesn't happen, people aren't able to pay their rent, they aren't able to pay the phone bill, they aren't able to meet their outgoings. That was top of our mind at all times during the pandemic, and that's why that timeliness and that accuracy was really top priority for all of us.
And the origin of the concept of the uplift, as the inquiry understands it, came from a commission which came from the Chancellor of the Exchequer to the department on or about the 17th of March of 2020, a commission to investigate and report on the delivery of an uplift, if that was possible, feasible.
So I don't know that for sure, but I have seen an email from the Secretary of State's private office, as I put in my witness statement at paragraph 17, that suggests it was an ask of the Chancellor specifically.
Yeah. And in terms of decision-making, it was a Department of Work and Pensions benefit. You've explained, however, effectively being funded by the Treasury and the Commission coming from the Treasury, but the decisions were made jointly, is that your understanding, between the Chancellor and the Secretary of State?
So yes, that's my understanding, although inevitably, and again, Lady, I've covered this in my witness statement, any spend outside of a departmental budget of £6.2 billion is ultimately going to be made by the Chancellor of the Exchequer. The Secretary of State would be the one who would say what is operationally deliverable and would be the one to operationalise the decision. But I think it's inconceivable that the ultimate decision wouldn't have been made by the Chancellor and the Prime Minister.
I mean, ultimately, the Chancellor's got to sign the cheque.
Correct. But I mean, that's conjecture on my part, but
Yeah.
that's my experience of government in every department I've
Yeah.
had the fortune to have served in.
So moving on to the policy objective of the uplift then, which is the second subtopic. Can we just, first of all, I'm sure agree about this, that good policy requires clear objectives as a general for government.
I agree.
Yeah. Because the clearer the objectives, the more you can focus on delivering them, the easier it is to evaluate whether you've achieved those objectives and monitor your ability to do so.
I agree.
Now, can we have, please, INQ 0006555668? This is the corporate statement from the department, which sets out 3 fiscal and social policy objectives for the uplift. So financially assist those likely to face the most significant financial disruption, Second, provide that assistance rapidly, and this, I think, goes to the point you were making earlier, without risking the stability of the social security system. Is that right?
That's right, yes.
And then finally, provide a clear and easy to understand policy that sends a reassuring message to the public. And that because this was a time of national emergency and great uncertainty, and it was considered necessary to reassure people that the government was going to stand behind them.
Correct.
Yeah. And those objectives, as set out in the corporate statement, do you consider those to be clear policy objectives?
Yes, I think I do. My understanding throughout, and although I didn't set the policy rationale or objective, or indeed make the decision, was that the UC uplift was designed to support those who are facing the most significant economic shock, and whether that was through a significant drop in income, as rightly been alluded to, there are those on universal credit who are in work but relatively low earners, and who may have seen a significant reduction in their hours or income, and therefore they would be suffering economic shock, or those who had lost their jobs altogether and were making a first ever claim for universal credit. My understanding was that they were the designed recipients, if you like, or policy rationale or objective of the policy.
Please, this isn't a criticism, but an observation. That is quite a number of concepts put together there as being the rationale. Can I just look at how you've put it in your statement and see if that helps? Paragraph 20 of your statement, please. You say there the decision to introduce universal credit uplift was essentially to provide additional financial support for new and existing claimants in response to the economic situation caused by the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yes.
So not just they're people who are newly unemployed, newly claiming benefits, but existing claimants who may have suffered financial hardship.
Well, that's not quite what I said.
No, well, what do you mean by it?
With respect, well, Milady, I think I was quite clear that it was those it wasn't economic hardship, it was economic shock through one of two events. The first is seeing a significant drop in income, or the second is through losing your job. And you might say that the effects are the same. But of course, if you were making a claim because you've lost your job for universal credit for the first time, then you'd be a new claimant, or you might be an existing claimant of universal credit who had either lost their job or had seen a significant drop in income. But I think, unless I'm misreading it, I've been really clear that my understanding was it was for those who had had an economic shock through loss of their job and therefore income, or seen a significant drop in their income as a direct result of the pandemic. And I've specifically said that I was not aware of the policy intent, and I think I've made this clear in paragraph 20 of my witness statement, of the rationale of or objective of the UC uplift being more broadly to support those on UC on universal credit, sorry, lady, who have faced economic hardship or additional costs as a result of the pandemic. Now, the consequence of the UC uplift is that they would have benefited. Those who had not seen that economic shock through loss of their job or a significant drop in income would still have benefited from the £20 uplift. So those who are on UC and would have faced increased costs would have still benefited. But the point I was making is that they were not, as I understand it, the original designed beneficiaries or recipients of the intended policy of the government.
So your position is that the intended recipients were those who were newly, by the shock of the pandemic, newly in receipt of benefits or who had suffered financial loss, so reduced income. That was the intended policy. The policy objective was to help that group.
That's my understanding. Yes, as I say, I didn't set that policy objective rationale, but that's my understanding. As a minister who would have gone out to in effect sell that policy, that was my understanding of the rationale intent, lady, of the government.
Yeah, and in fact, I think you go a bit further. If we could have a paragraph 112, please. The second sentence there, as I recall, it was not designed specifically to address inequalities and economically vulnerable groups. So is that the point you make? The intention was to help those newly economically impacted by the pandemic.
That's right.
As you understood it.
And I think it may be even worth adding that I think the Chancellor at the time even made the point that there were other measures that he was putting in place to support those, in addition to the universal credit uplift. For example, the local housing allowance uprating to the 30th percentile would have benefited far more people than those just on universal credit, for example, who would have been fallen into the economically vulnerable group category.
This was one measure amongst other measures that the government was taking. And do you also support the view that the objective of the uplift was not to meet the increased costs of individuals? So the increased costs that are occasioned by the pandemic, but rather to cushion, as it were, the blow for those who had lost their employment or lost earnings.
That's certainly in the two paragraphs you've just shown me. That's what I made clear, and that's my understanding of the sort of policy objective of the centre.
Yeah. I wonder if we could have up, please, INQ 00065774-1. This is the statement of Katie Farrington, who was a DWP official at the time. And paragraph 37, she makes that point. That second paragraph at the bottom there, the UC uplift was primarily intended to provide financial support to everyone rather than meeting the increased costs of individuals. Does that accord with your understanding?
I'd have to read the paragraph above.
Well, by all means, take your time. And
it depends what was primarily intended to provide financial support to everyone for the reasons set out. So I think the context in which, and it's very difficult without getting into the mind of Katie Farrington, who, by the way, is a superb official and an expert in everything universal credit. I think that is in the context of whether the £20 uplift being paid universally to everyone on universal credit versus being targeted specifically, as in when she says provide financial support for everyone, I think that is in relation to whether the universal credit additional uplift could have been targeted or if it was universal in nature. I don't think she's referring there to the policy rationale, if you like. But it's probably a better question for Katie Farrington.
Yeah. I mean, the point I'm getting at is the point I think you've already agreed with, that this wasn't about covering people's increased living costs. This was about cushioning the fact that people had lost employment. That was what it was intended to do.
That's right. But from a DWP minister perspective, I was delighted that it did go further because I knew that there were people that were facing hardship and additional costs, and the fact that there were the consequence of the whether it was unintended or not, the additional beneficiaries of the £20 uplift because of the universal nature of it. I was delighted that there were more people benefiting than just those who the government initially intended through the policy objective or rationale. It certainly helped me in terms of my objectives, in terms of reducing poverty and child poverty, and I welcomed it.
So just to unpack that, are you saying effectively that the fact that it also did lots of other good things doesn't take away from what its actual policy objective was?
Yes, I think that's right. And very often when it comes to government policy and decision making, there will be a very good reason, lady, for a decision and a policy, and there's a rationale and objective for it, but there are consequences and unintended consequences that come alongside it that are not necessarily aligned to the original policy intent. More often than not, they are good consequences. Sometimes they are negative consequences. But in this case, in my view, it was a positive or good consequence that far more people benefited than just those that were the original intended recipients.
I think you've been clear that this wasn't just for new claimants of benefits. It was also for people who were receiving universal credit and who had lost employment, so they'd lost some income. Is that right?
Well, yes, or could have been claiming universal credit because they were in low income, my lady, but then actually lost that income.
Yes.
So they could have seen a dramatic drop in income. And the way universal credit works is it tapers off as your income increases. So there would have been people on universal credit who would have seen a reduction in hours or a drop in income. Or those who had lost their jobs altogether, who would have already been on a claimant for universal credit. So yes.
Do you think there was any confusion in the department about that? In other words, whether there was confusion as to whether it applied to those people or whether it was intended only to apply to those who were totally new to the system?
No, I don't think so. Certainly not in my experience.
I'm just going to ask for INQ 000655625 to be put up on the screen. This is Neil Cooling's statement. And I accept it's difficult, but it's not your statement. But I'd just be interested in your view about this. Paragraph 3.35, please. The universal credit uplift was designed as a flat rate to provide rapid support to those newly unemployed or experienced reduced incomes and therefore new to the benefit system. Does that accord with your understanding or not?
No, not really. Simply because you could already be on universal credit and be in exactly the same situation and circumstance as somebody that's making a new claim because of the nature of it being an in-work and out-of-work benefit. So I'm not sure why Neil said that, and Milady, I learned very early on, don't question much around universal credit with Neil because he is the oracle. He knows everything about the universal credit system. Doesn't mean we didn't occasionally challenge each other on things, but on this, I don't agree because those on universal credit who would have been in work and lost their job were not new to the benefit system, but they would have clearly been the same people in the same position as those who had lost their employment and making a claim for the first time.
All right. But the key thing is, as far as you're concerned, that wasn't your understanding of the position.
No, but I don't think it actually makes a fundamental difference because the two individuals, whether they were already on universal credit or not on universal credit, were in effect in the same position in that they're facing the same significant drop in income or loss of employment and therefore significant drop in income. So it's probably semantics, but I think whether they're new to the benefit system or not, I don't think is overly relevant. It's their circumstances which are almost identical.
I do wonder, Mr. Wright, if we're dancing on the head of a pin a bit.
Well, I certainly don't want to do that. I wouldn't stay on it for very long, I don't think. But I'm going to move on in any event. Can I move on to another issue about policy objective, and that relates to legacy benefits?
Of course.
Now, we know that a decision was taken not to apply an uplift to legacy benefits. Okay? So far as you're concerned, was that a decision that was taken because to provide an uplift to legacy benefits wouldn't have aligned with the policy objective? Or was it a decision taken for operational reasons, or indeed both, or neither? What do you say were the factors that meant that it wasn't applied to legacy benefits?
So I don't know for certain, lady, because I wasn't privy to the decision-making chain or process in that regard, but I can give my view as to what I think. And I've seen the paragraph referred to, I think, in Neil Cooling's statement in relation to those in receipt of legacy benefits not being necessarily the intended beneficiaries of the basis of the uplift as set out by the Treasury. But in my experience and the dealings that I had in terms of the policy, it was more, in fact, in my view, exclusively about the ability of the systems to deliver an equivalent uplift to the legacy benefits. And the only reason I hesitate a little bit around the policy differential is because legacy benefits, there are several, but of course there would have been people who had lost their jobs who would have claimed contributory job seekers allowance, who wouldn't have been eligible to claim universal credit, perhaps because they had because it's a means-tested benefit and because they may have, for example, over £16,000 in savings. So there would have been some people who would have lost their jobs, or seen a significant drop in income, who would have applied for JSA, who might still meet the criteria, I suspect. But as far as I was concerned, it was simply about the clear advice of officials, including Neil Cooling, that the legacy benefit systems couldn't be uprated mid-year, and it would take several months to introduce an equivalent uplift for those legacy benefits.
Can I just check I've understood what you've said? So I think you therefore accept there could be people who are in receipt of legacy benefits who could come within the policy objective of the benefit, but your understanding is that the reason it couldn't be done was operational. This was simply not feasible.
So the JSA, or job seekers allowance point, is conjecture on my part because it's not my area of expertise, but my understanding is during the pandemic people could, if they had the work history and contributions, apply for contributory JSA. If they were eligible, I suspect they could have also applied for universal credit. But as far as I was concerned, in terms of the conversations that I had with Neil Cooling and the Secretary of State and others in the department, it was about the capabilities and capacities of the systems that were aging and archaic. And Neil Cooling had been talking to us for the best part of the last year since I joined the department about how clunky these systems were and difficult, and this is why we needed to migrate and move people over to universal credit, that they just simply wouldn't have coped and handled a mid-year uplift.
Yeah, I mean, I'll ask please that INQ 00657741 is put on the screen, please, and paragraph 33. This is Katie Farrington's statement again, which I think aligns with what you've just told us. So that part is headed operational limitations. However, and in the middle there, the operational team who reported to Neil Cooling concluded this was not feasible as it would require a new IT build and it would not be possible to create a new system within this tight time frame. So that appears to be a problem with old IT infrastructure coupled with the need to move at significant pace. Is that fair?
I think that is fair, and I can't find the exact reference, but I know it's exhibited to my witness statement. But there is and I think it's in the evidence pack as well, there is a particular email, I think, between special advisors and my private office where they're debating in response to, I think, a written parliamentary question, whether they put, we have no plans to uprate legacy benefits. And a deputy director with responsibility for this area replied to that email saying, we can't say we've got no plans because it's not actually possible. The system cannot do it unless we significantly upgrade the IT systems, which wouldn't have been possible or practical during the pandemic.
Now, this may or may not be the email you're talking about, but I hope it is.
I think was the Deputy Director.
Well, I'll ask that 00657862 is put up, please. And if we look at the bottom there, it says in the middle, we could uprate in UC relatively quickly, but not in legacy. The lead-in times for the IT on legacy is very long. First reaction was April 2021. We'll push on that to see what could be done to expedite, but just wanted to flag. I mean, that's a year's lag to uprate the IT systems.
Yes, I mean that's my understanding too, and yeah, I recall having conversations, and I think this is in my witness statement too, with the Minister for Disabled People. I was keen for us to explore uprating legacy benefits. The clear pushback from the department was we don't have the system capability to be able to do this, and we may come on to it, but we did explore potential other options, all of which carried system risk. But you're absolutely right that the systems were clunky, they were difficult to operate, they were coding that was decades. I think Neil used to remind us some of them were 60 or 70 years old. They were not fit for purpose, and this is why Universal Credit was created, and the department had clear plans and strategies to migrate people onto universal credit, so those systems could start to be phased out.
The evidence is it would take, in ordinary times, about 5 months to program the system each year for payments.
Correct, that's my understanding
given
as well.
Its the archaic nature. Just picking up on this, looking ahead, because I don't want to get into an area which is effectively no longer a problem. Is it right that the programme of reform has continued so that people are being moved across onto universal credit, and there is an end point envisaged for legacy claims, so that it won't be necessary really to explore what could be done with
yes,
those systems?
that's certainly my understanding. And although I've been out of politics really now for just over a year, and delightfully so, but my understanding is yes, it has continued, and it wasn't just about the clunky nature of those systems and the inflexibility of them. It was also because we frankly knew that there were hundreds of thousands of people who were not claiming all of the benefits they were potentially entitled to because the legacy benefit system was complex and it had cliff edges and all sorts of issues with it. And universal credit resolved many of those. So there were many reasons other than just the system capability and the clunky nature of it that meant that universal credit was a much better system.
Now, you mentioned other things that you looked at that you could do. Is it right that one of the things you explored was whether it would be feasible to make a one-off payment to legacy benefit claimants, acknowledging the IT difficulties and the inability to uprate legacy benefits, that you looked at whether or not you could make a one-off payment if ministers wanted to pursue that?
Yes, that's right.
But ultimately, I think, concluded two things. First, that primary legislation would have been required. Is that right?
That's right. So I think I don't want to preempt your next question, but I think I scribbled down just before coming in, actually looking at the one-off payment, why we were advised at the time that it carried a lot of risk. The First Lady was in relation to system. We'd need to create a new system in which to do that. I think the only system that existed was in relation to winter fuel payments. There was also a capacity issue around we had all of our people processing claims and on the universal credit system itself and just keeping systems running. We would need to pull people off that to design and manage a new system. There was also an issue with data and data sets, and there was a real risk of duplicate payments and eligibility. a potential high risk of fraud and error, and it would be virtually impossible, I was told, to recover any payments made in error. And then you're absolutely right. There would be primary legislation required. And then the final one, which was always a concern of mine, and it was also echoed by the Work and Pensions Select Committee, also, milady, was that there is a risk in making large one-off single payments, in particular around vulnerable and disadvantaged claimants, that a very large amount of money going into a bank account as opposed to a smaller monthly payment can actually be very damaging when it comes to, and I'm not stereotyping, and this is based on the advice of stakeholders also, but when it comes to drug and alcohol addiction in particular, such a large payment going in one payment, which was actually designed for a 3, 6, 12-month period, might actually have some potentially very damaging unintended consequences.
And so for all of those reasons, did you ultimately conclude that you wouldn't take any further the idea of a one-off payment for those in receipt of legacy benefits?
Well, ultimately, the Secretary of State would have taken that decision, but my advice to her is, I don't recall exactly what it was, milady, but my advice on the basis of everything I've just said and the clear advice of officials would have been that this was not a sensible thing to pursue.
Now, you mentioned making a comparison between the modern IT systems of Universal Credit and the relative functionality of that system compared to legacy benefits. You also mentioned a lot of people on legacy benefits weren't claiming what they were entitled to, and you extolled the virtues of Universal Credit as a much simpler system. Was there also a sense in which you wanted to encourage people during the pandemic to move from legacy benefits onto Universal Credit?
So I was asked this question specifically and responded in my witness statement. I don't think it ever came up as a reason for the decision in relation to legacy benefits. And the reason I say that is that, as I said just a few moments ago, my understanding is the only reason we could not make the payment to legacy benefits recipients was the system capability. It wasn't to do with sort of any other reason for example, wanting people to move on to Universal Credit. And in fact, during the pandemic, we paused work, is my understanding, on the move to UC pilot because of system capability. The system was under enough pressure with people naturally moving on to Universal Credit anyway. Having said all that, I come back to the point I mentioned about sort of consequences and unintended consequences and design consequences. And as soon as a decision was taken that an uplift similar to that of Universal Credit wasn't possible in relation to legacy benefits, then inevitably, yes, it would have been the case that those who would be better off on Universal Credit, either before or because of the £20 uplift, would have, who felt they were better off, moved on to Universal Credit, which would have also met another overarching government priority or policy, but it was not a driver for the decision in relation to legacy benefits.
Can I ask that we put up, please, INQ 00549336, please? Now this is a WhatsApp message sent by you to the then Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rishi Sunak, saying he's doing a sterling job. I know a package UC is being worked up. Fully support uprating the standard allowance. Not only is it the right thing to do, helps negate the 5-week wait issue, and will encourage more people to move to UC from legacy benefits. Any questions you only have to ask. Is that an example of what you've described as an unintended benefit? So if people move across, that's a good thing?
Yes, and I think I don't know the exact timings, although there's the timing on the message, but I don't know the exact timings in terms of how. My understanding is that a decision was already taken in terms of the capability of delivering an uplift to legacy benefits. But I knew at the same time that a package was being worked up by the Chancellor in relation to sort of broader economic support ahead of an announcement. And I think just to step back for a moment, and I think you're right in terms of there's a risk that you sort of add 2 and 2 and get 5. It was an unintended consequence. But once the decision had been taken not to uplift legacy benefits in line with universal credit because of system capability, it just wasn't naturally an additional selling point of uplifting universal credit. By the way, a decision that had not, as I understand it, been taken at this point, another benefit of doing so. And for me, the real risk was that I didn't know, and I don't think the Secretary of State knew I sent this message to the Chancellor, but I wasn't aware that the Chancellor had locked in the universal credit uplift policy. It was £6.2 billion worth of spend. It was something that I had desperately wanted to see for a long time, along with the local housing allowance raised to the 30th percentile. And by gosh, I was going to do everything I possibly could to make sure the Chancellor announced it, knowing that millions of people would benefit. And I've always taken the view, as I said, I would have liked legacy benefits to have been rated in line with universal credit, but I wasn't going to let the perfect be the enemy of the good.
Was there a sense in which, as a junior minister in the DWP, you thought, well, let's bank this? There's going to be extra money being put into the department and put into universal credit, and that's a good thing. Whatever the objective is, if it has wider benefits, let's bank that effectively.
I think I'm not sure the former Chancellor and Prime Minister would thank me for saying this, but yeah, my job was to try and extract as much as I possibly could out of the Treasury to support vulnerable and disadvantaged groups who are claiming universal credit. And that did mean on occasion that he no doubt got frustrated with me. But yes, absolutely. The opportunity to get an extra £6.2 billion pumped into our benefit system, providing that additional support, yes, to those who were the intended beneficiaries and recipients as per the Treasury's policy. But I knew the benefit was going to be far wider than just that group. And I very much welcomed that. And I was going to fight for it.
Thank you. I just wanted to show you one more communication on this point, linked point. INQ 000655317, please. Now, this is the email chain between your Assistant Private Secretary to yourself, I think, and other DWP colleagues. This arises in the context of the extension of the uplift. But if we look at paragraph 3 at the bottom there, by creating the natural cliff edge, you create a huge incentive to move to universal credit, making the pilot largely redundant with huge numbers moving naturally at lower cost saving on transitional protection. Is that an extension of the same point that we saw in the message to the Chancellor? If there's a benefit, an unintended benefit, then it's a good thing.
Well, this, of course, was on the 6th of August 2020, and it was in relation to looking at an extension of the universal credit uplift. And at that point, I don't think any decision had been taken on whether either UC was going to be extended further, or there was a way of uprating legacy benefits in the future. In essence, actually, in reality, the decision wasn't taken until the spring of the next year, much to my frustration. But this particular email, and I'm not overly proud of it because it's more punchy than perhaps I would ordinarily have been, but it was because I received via my private office a communication to suggest the Secretary of State was not minded to bid for an extension of the uplift, but instead favoured work incentives. And I'm afraid I sort of read a little bit of that and thought, right, well, I'm going to list back all of the reasons why I think that would not be a sensible move, because my position from the beginning was that the UC uplift is something that should be kept in perpetuity, and failing that, it should have been extended. So, and actually, I think it may have been a communication error, my lady, because the Secretary's office came back, I think even by the end of that day, saying, no, the Secretary of State's view is in line with yours, and that this is what
we'll come on to the as it were, the efforts between the Secretary of State and yourself to persuade the Treasury to make the uplift permanent. But can I just pick up one point about this? The last part of paragraph 3, at lower cost saving on transitional protection. Transitional protection applied to some disabled people, didn't it, who were given transitional protection when they moved onto universal credit. So this reference to a lower cost saving, did that mean there'd be an incentive and that it would be cheaper to get people to move across to universal credit sooner?
Well, my understanding, and my recollection is hazy on this, so I apologise, it's 5 years ago, but Lady, my understanding is transitional protection was actually quite an involved process. So you had to sit down with the individual, it usually involved a work coach, and they would work out, and I think it was a manual calculation as well. This was done as part of the move to UC pilot. So it was a costly exercise to do, whereas if people migrate naturally onto universal credit because they've gone on to the benefit calculator and they work out that they will be better off, then the department doesn't have that administrative burden and cost of undertaking that transitional protection review and then making the arrangements to transfer. So was my understanding. I mean, it's difficult because it wasn't my specific area, Lady, of expertise. It would have fallen under the Minister for Disabled People. But my understanding is it was a more involved process, and if people move naturally, then you would avoid that.
Just move on then to look at the policy design of the uplift relatively briefly. Is it your position that one of the key things was the need for speed? This had to happen quickly in terms of delivering the uplift?
Without question, yes.
So however it was going to be done, it needed to be something that could be done very quickly.
That my understanding, again, it wasn't my decision, but my understanding is that the Chancellor wanted measures that could be announced and operationalised quickly.
Yep.
And he was right to do that because he knew what was coming. Well, we all sort of had an inkling of what was coming, but he, more than most, would have had access to data to see what was coming and the decisions that were going to be made around lockdown and other things, that he knew the likely implication for the labour market, the jobs market, and therefore it couldn't wait months. It needed to be a swift intervention that reassured people that the government stood with them.
Yeah. And was one of the consequences of that it meant that the additional monies were paid to some people who weren't in the intended beneficiary group?
Correct. And again, it wasn't my decision, but I think no doubt the ability of being able to operate universal credit at scale and speed, I think it was done within just a handful of days, was of course hugely advantageous. And yes, it did mean that there were many more people than just those who were the intended beneficiaries of the policy intent that ultimately benefited. But that to me was a positive.
We've heard it described in Neil Cooling's statement as an unavoidable windfall for those people. You may not align yourself with those words.
I think I would describe that language as clumsy, and I think certainly I don't know if that's attributed to Neil, but it's uncharacteristic if it is.
Yes, it's from his statement.
Okay, well I don't think anybody who was receiving a standard allowance of £76 a week that went up to 20 by an extra £20, you would describe that as a windfall.
No.
And you know I knew full well through all of the meetings that I had with stakeholders pre-pandemic and during pandemic, those that were supporting and advocating for those with lived experience of the pandemic, that people were struggling and that the universal credit rates were not particularly high. In fact, they were challenging for many, and I would never use that language of a windfall. I think for many it was a lifeline.
So is your position, I don't want to put words in your mouth, that yes, it didn't deliver the extra money just to those who were the intended beneficiaries, but from your perspective, that was because of the need for speed and ease of delivery. And if that meant that other people got additional money, that was a good thing, so far as you were concerned,
Correct.
given where the baseline of universal credit was.
That's right. And it was all about operational deliverability at speed and scale, and universal credit was the vehicle in which to do that. And we did explore, as I no doubt will come on to later on, more targeted approaches, and we did explore that at great depth. But ultimately, this is something that had to be delivered within a handful of days, and we wanted to make sure that people were reassured that the system would deliver. This is something which we weren't 100%, but we were pretty confident could deliver if we threw all of the departmental resource at it, and that's what we did.
Yeah. Do you think in a future emergency that having systems in place that would enable greater and efficient targeting would be a good thing?
So yes, I think it would be, and I think alongside that, you also need the data. And one of the things that I had been pushing for since joining the department, and we did manage to start bringing in during COVID and accelerated that process. Neil was the one that enabled this for me.
So just talking of accelerating, can we just slow down
sorry,
a little bit?
Yes.
Just a bit.
Sorry, I do apologise.
No, don't worry.
It was not possible to identify vulnerable or disadvantaged claimants in the universal credit system. It was a flaw that both I and the former Minister for Disabled People, Justin Tomlinson, identified. So, for example, I couldn't at that point tell you who was a care leaver, who was a prison leaver, who was a survivor of domestic abuse, who had experience of homelessness or rough sleeping. But those are really important characteristics, if people are willing to share them, that would enable the department to be able to target resource more effectively. That work was being done, and it was actually accelerated during COVID, starting with veterans as another group, Milady, that I wanted to be able to identify for obvious reasons. So the data alongside the ability to target and a toolkit or number of measures that are in the department's arsenal and able to deploy at scale and speed, I think would be hugely beneficial.
I've picked it up there. I undertake to you that we'll come back to the future and recommendations, and you can expand on that. And I want to ask you some questions at that stage about the potential for a household data set and so on and so forth, which I think aligns with what you've just been dealing with. Again, I'm sure you'll say because of the need for speed, a flat rate was applied. So this was a flat rate payment that didn't take account of household need. For example, a single parent with 3 children received the same uplift as a single person living alone. I mean, if you'd have had the ability to target so that the person with 3 children received additional monies, would you have taken that course?
So I have to caveat the answer with it wasn't my decision.
No, would you have advocated that?
But would I have advocated?
Well,
yes, absolutely. And it was only a handful of months later that I was exploring a hybrid model, which was a £10 uplift for all universal credit recipients and a £10 uplift to the child element. I think the child element is one that should be explored. But you're absolutely right. At the time, it was about speed and system capability, and designing something new just wasn't feasible or practicable, and certainly wouldn't have been sensible, and would have been against the advice of the officials that knew the system inside and out at the time. But the ability to, based on data, and the data is the critical bit, to be able to target resource more effectively and ensure that those who are the intended beneficiaries, as in those who are the most disadvantaged by a situation, and any potential future pandemic or civil emergency may take very different forms. You may want to, for example, look at young people or care leavers and prioritise them over those with children. But you may not, and the ability to target, I think, would be beneficial.
Right. Mr. Quince, my lady, could we take the break there? That's 3
Of
o'clock.
course, certainly.
Thank you.
We take a 15-minute break every so often for everybody's benefit, but I promise you we will finish you today. So I shall return at 3:15.
All rise.
Mr. Wright.
Thank you, my lady. Mr. Quince, back to policy design and another element of policy design, which I'll ask you, why £20?
So the honest answer is I don't know, because I didn't take the decision, but my understanding is it was largely to align the rate with statutory sick pay,
Yeah.
or as close as it could be to. And the emails that I've seen and the sort of policy documents that I've seen suggest that is the case.
Yeah. And just to help you with that, if we could have up, please, INQ 000 657864, which is an email, I think, of the sort you're referring to.
Yes.
Yeah, so at the bottom there we see, now copied to Jonathan and Lindsay. Grateful if you could treat sensitively. Chancellor will announce at 5 p.m. that the universal credit standard allowance will be increased temporarily by £20 per week to take it broadly to the rate of statutory sick pay for over 25s at a cost of more than 3.5 billion. So your understanding, as you say, not your decision, the pounds, but your understanding was this was to align, broadly speaking, with statutory sick pay.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. We heard evidence this morning from Dr. Mike Brewer, who's an expert who's provided a report to the inquiry from the Resolution Foundation. And he made the point that he described in his report as being arguably unfair, that a worker didn't decide whether they were furloughed or lost their job. So it was outside the worker's control as to whether their employer used the CJRS scheme or made them redundant. And he made the point that there was a significant difference to the sum of money that a newly unemployed person who had been in work would receive under universal credit, even uprated, as compared to the money they might have received if they were furloughed. And if you look at the respective spend across the schemes, that one is significantly in excess of the other. Now, accepting that those weren't your decisions, can you rationalise why there was such a gulf between what was available through universal credit, through a policy that was designed to support those who'd newly lost their jobs, as compared to furlough or the self-employed scheme?
Lady, it's a great question, but I think one only really the former Chancellor of the Exchequer can answer. It would be wholly hypothetical, and I don't think I'm qualified to answer that question, because I wasn't involved in the furlough scheme or the Treasury thinking or even the decision around the £20 figure uplift, whereas the former Chancellor will know exactly, because he designed both schemes.
Let me just approach it from the other side, which you might be able to help us with. And I don't want to push you into an area where you say, look, I just can't answer this. But I'd asked you some questions about targeting, and you'd explained that the need for speed and delivery meant that there wasn't time to target, and there's a data problem. But had you been able to target, you could have given a greater uprating to universal credit, couldn't you, to those who had newly become unemployed, and close that gap?
Oh, I see. Well, I mean, systems-wise, I don't think we could have done, no. And certainly not within a matter of a handful of days. I'm not even sure the capability exists to be able to differentiate those two claimants, not least the inequity that it would create between new and existing claimants to universal credit, and that cohort who will have experienced a similar economic shock, who have suffered a significant drop in income or lost their employment but were already on universal credit. So I don't think it would have been possible technically, even if the political will would have been there. But I think your broader question is around the sort of adequacy, perhaps, and I don't want to drift, maybe, because I know you've made it clear that's not within scope of the benefit system. But universal credit was never designed to replace all of somebody's income, or indeed for it to be directly on par with the furlough scheme, which of course didn't exist at that point in time. But I do think the Chancellor is really the only person that can answer that satisfactorily.
Well, I'm not going to ask you to go any further on that then. Can I ask you another topic, though, related to policy design? And that is the fact that the benefit cap was maintained. So we heard that the benefit cap is designed to encourage people to go back into work. It has a 9-month grace period. So somebody newly claiming universal credit would have 9 months before the benefit cap kicked in. But first of all, somebody who was already claiming universal credit but had suffered a loss of income wouldn't have that grace period, would they?
No, they wouldn't. I mean, I've just got to caveat my answer, my lady, by just saying that I was not the minister with responsibility for the benefit cap. And actually, having said that, I'm hugely sympathetic to the position that those who were capped during the pandemic found themselves in, especially those who were newly capped. I think you're absolutely right that those who had were new to universal credit, that had a sustained work history, would have received a 9-month grace period. But I would just, although I wasn't the minister and I'm sort of drifting into an area that was not something I was responsible for or have a huge amount of knowledge about, but I'd just come back to those sort of fundamental principles that are twofold. One is the benefit cap was set in primary legislation and therefore would have required primary legislation to change it. And the second is that it again would have taken time and resource in the department, which we just didn't have at the time. I haven't seen the Minister for Employment's submission to the inquiry or witness statement, so I can't comment, but I suspect she has covered in great detail the benefit cap. But I think in terms of system capacity and indeed the requirement for primary legislation, it wouldn't have been a priority for those reasons, because we had to prioritise keeping the system overall operational.
Did you not have a meeting with the Child Poverty Action Group in September of 2020 where they raised the benefit cap with you?
Yes, I did. And there is a readout of that meeting, I think, exhibited to my witness statement, where I did make I had actually really good working relationship with CPAG. They do some brilliant work, and we met, I think, several times over the course of the pandemic.
I don't want to jump in, but they also followed it up with a letter.
They did follow it up with a letter.
The difficulty caused by the benefit cap.
And I would just gently point out, though, in that meeting, the readout does make really clear that I wasn't the minister with responsibility, as much as I was keen to help, responsibility for the benefit cap. And that's why Mims Davis, the Minister for Employment, responded to that letter, not me. And to be fair to CPAG, the letter covered both the benefit cap and the universal credit uplift. So both elements. But
leaving aside that you weren't the minister responsible, what did you think about it? You were in the department. Did you think that the maintenance of the benefit cap was aligned with the policy and was a fair thing or not?
I won't get into the detail, lady, of the benefit cap more broadly, but during the pandemic, I think there's documents within my evidence bundle which shows that I did look at whether I pushed the Minister for Employment to look at whether it should be reviewed as part of a number of measures. But again, these were all scoped out, and in that case, I think it was ruled not deemed to be something that we should explore on the basis of there were competing priorities and there were greater priorities, namely the biggest, which is the keeping the system operational and ensuring that claimants are paid in a sort of timely and accurate fashion. So would I have liked to have seen it looked at, an exemption put in place? Yes, I would, but on the basis of it requiring primary legislation, coming with a cost, and the bandwidth within the department to be able to deal with that, both legislatively and also just capacity-wise, I just don't think it would have been realistic.
So does this go effectively into the bucket of trade-offs that are necessary in a time of emergency to deliver support?
Unfortunately, yes.
Right. Can I ask you, moving on then, about how effective implementation was, and really just a couple of questions about this. First of all, is this right that the uplift was delivered automatically to all recipients of universal credit and working tax credit without any need to apply? So if you were in receipt of that benefit, it was automatically applied?
So I can't comment in relation to working tax credit because that was a Treasury administered benefit and not within my responsibility, but you're absolutely right. Universal credit payment would have been automatic to those who were claiming.
Yeah.
So yes.
So talking about speed of delivery and simplicity, no processing of application forms, no checks or anything to be done. If you were already in receipt, then it's applied.
Correct.
Can I just pick up on one issue? In ordinary times, the inquiry understands there's a 5-week wait for the first payment of universal credit. Do you accept that 5-week wait, which was maintained during the pandemic, would have posed issues for the newly unemployed who were, after all, the intended beneficiary group?
So gosh, we could get into a very long debate about the 5-week wait, which really I'm not going to do. You'll be pleased to hear. So I think there wasn't any capacity or scope or bandwidth or the ability to change the setup and makeup of the IT system within such a short period of time. Even if we had wanted to, it just wasn't a priority. And there was already a well-established principle and process of advances. So a claimant could get an advance, because the way universal credit works, it's very similar to employment, and it's a month in arrears, but you can in effect have an advance which you then pay back over a period of time. And I'd already been doing some work behind the scenes to ensure universal credit recipients kept more money in their pockets. So, for example, in the fiscal event just before the pandemic, I'd managed to secure an extension of the advance repayment period from 16 months to 24 months, which is significant in terms of the amount of the deduction spread over a longer period. And then also a cap on the maximum deduction from 30% to 25%. They don't sound significant, but actually in terms of your universal credit payment every month, they are significant. I wanted to assure people kept more money in their pockets at the end of every month. So that advance process was available during the pandemic, and people still could get a universal credit payment via an advance, usually within 24 hours.
Okay, thank you. Moving on then, within the topic of the uplift, the extension of the policy, next subheading, from April of 2021. So, as the inquiry understands it, introduced for 12 months, get to April 2021, and there was an extension for 6 months. And I want to really pick up three areas here. First, whether there were disagreements in government about whether to extend, and if so, for how long. Second, the timing of the decision to extend. And third, the continued exclusion of legacy benefits, because we are now a year on from the introduction in April of 2021. All right. So taking those in turn, disagreements about whether to extend, and again, accepting that the decision was not yours. The decision was effectively taken, is this right, between the Secretary of State, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and the Prime Minister.
Correct.
Yeah.
Well, that's certainly my understanding.
That was how you understood things were being done. And is this right, that your clear preference was that the uplift should be made permanent, first of all?
Yes.
And failing that it certainly should be extended?
Yes.
And does this go back to the point you'd made earlier, that this was extra money into the system that you felt was needed? However it had come into the system, you wanted to maintain it?
So correct. And I've been really clear in my witness statement, and I've been careful not to criticise the Chancellor, not because we disagreed, and we did on this one, but because the reason for me wanting to see the universal credit uplift made permanent was more because of the impact it had on low-income individuals, disadvantaged and vulnerable groups, and there's significant impact in terms of turning the dial on poverty, lifting around 950,000 people out of poverty, I think around 300,000 of whom were children. It was a very effective measure in that regard, and putting aside the Treasury's focus, which I suspect would have been on the original policy intent of the uplift, and indeed the prevailing epidemiological and labour market position, putting that aside, I would wanted it to be retained because of the wider societal benefits and to those individual claimants for whom I knew it was an absolute vital lifeline and transformational.
Thank you. Now, the inquiry knows that on the 25th of September 2020, the Secretary of State wrote to the Prime Minister expressing her view that the uplift should be made permanent for all the reasons that you have just given, and asked officials in the department to prepare options on the future of the uplift to present to the Prime Minister. By October of 2020, things had shifted slightly, perhaps, and we understand that the Secretary of State wanted to maintain the uplift, but there was a suggestion now that there should be a reduction in the standard allowance to £10, and the child element should be uplifted by £10 a week, which would, correct me if I'm wrong, be an example of a slightly more targeted level of support, so that those who had children would get more money than those who didn't. Did your thinking align with that?
It did, and we were scoping out numerous options, and that particular option turned the dial more significantly on child poverty, and it was in line with CPAG and other stakeholders representing, in particular, vulnerable groups, but also children, that were pushing for it to be more targeted. So we did explore that measure. It was fully worked up by officials. I think a formal proposal was put to the Chancellor and the Prime Minister via the DWP Secretary of State. But ultimately, my understanding is the Prime Minister rejected it and gave some clear reasons for it.
We'll come on to that, but thank you for that answer. And is it fair to say that by this point, then, that from your perspective, that your focus had shifted from providing support to those who'd lost their jobs in the pandemic to this longer-term aspiration of lifting people out of poverty? So far as the continuation of the uplift was concerned, it wasn't really about the pandemic for you anymore? Is that fair?
No, it still absolutely was, because the labour market hadn't recovered, and I think if you refer even back to my email to the Secretary of State's office on the 6th of August, I make that point that that COVID was very much still with us. The labour market hadn't recovered. The original policy intent still stood, but what we had now was that additional evidence which showed the broader positive benefit that the policy had. So the original intent stood, but there were, in my view, from a DWP minister's perspective, some other really compelling reasons why this should be retained over and above the existent and remaining objectives as set by the Treasury.
And you privately were lobbying other MPs, ministers, to try and secure that permanent extension, weren't you?
Well, I'm conscious I shouldn't have been, and it probably wasn't in line with collective responsibility, but yes, I was.
If we could see INQ 00549332, please. This is between you and Michael Gove. Will I be able to have 5 minutes of your time to flag a political issue coming down the track with a temporary £20 per week universal credit uplift? I fear this could be much worse than free school meals if we do not get this right. Would like to put it on the radar. Keen to touch on the future. Is that right?
Yes, and look, I'm conscious I probably shouldn't have. I was bound by collective responsibility, but at the same time, I was determined behind the scenes to do all I could to persuade the Chancellor and use every avenue that I had available to me to keep the uplift. And I was keen to stress to Michael, who I believe had the ear of the Prime Minister. I think he was the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster at the time, so had a more political hat on perhaps than any other member of the Cabinet, just to make sure that he was aware that this was coming down the track. And I was also keen just to stress that we needed a decision as quickly as possible. And I understand why the Chancellor would have wanted to keep to fiscal events. They always do, and I totally get that. But when we're talking about benefit claimants, there is something about notice and timing and ensuring that people have time to budget. And although it was, as the Chancellor will no doubt say, always badged as a temporary measure, people need to know as soon as possible if it's going to continue or if it's going to be taken away. And I made that point to the Chancellor and to the Prime Minister at the time.
Yeah. Well, let's pick up the timing point. I was going to ask you some more questions about the disagreement, but I think you've been quite frank, if I may say so, about that and your position and the Chancellor's position. And so let's move on to that timing point. The reality is that eventually it was decided that it would be extended. The uplift would be extended. There was a trilateral meeting, we understand, between the Prime Minister, the Chancellor and the Secretary of State on the 15th of January 2021. And of course, it's due to end in April, the end of April. So that date is getting closer and closer. We understand there was a further trilateral meeting on the 4th of February of 2021, and it was on the 18th of February at a bilateral between the Chancellor and the Prime Minister that the uplift was finally secured. So not much more than a month before it was due to end. And what are your concerns about how it took so long and the impact of, or the effect of announcing that sort of policy just before it's going to end?
Well, I mean, I think if you were the Chancellor, and thankfully I never was, you would say, well, hold on, it was always badged as a temporary measure, milady, and it was due to end at X point, and then there was instead a positive decision to extend it. So the extant position was that it was going to end in the spring. The fact the Chancellor then made a decision to extend it, very positive move in my view. I think the problems with that, and I made this clear in other messages and meetings with and discussions with colleagues, is that when you're dealing with those who are on very low incomes, actually the ability to plan ahead and budget is really, really important. So that the greater lead time you give people as to whether they are going to have an additional £20 a week coming in via their universal credit account is really, really important. And I was just trying to stress that point, that the earlier the decision is made, the more people have time. And we're talking about some very vulnerable and disadvantaged people around the country have time to plan for any change that might be coming, or staying the same if it is indeed staying the same.
I'm going to ask to that end if INQ 00549330 could go up, please. This is a message from you to the Prime Minister, then Prime Minister, on that point about timing. I totally agree with you, boss, and we'll go out to bat on Monday for Her Majesty's government. But please, can we make a decision on universal credit soonest, and certainly pre the budget on 3rd March, as to give universal credit claimants less than a month's notice of a significant drop in benefit, would be so very difficult for many who already struggle with budgeting. That's really the point you've just made, set out in the message.
Yes, it is, and it's not normal practice for a parliamentary under Secretary of State to be sending messages to the Prime Minister. But I was increasingly concerned about the time it was taking to make a decision. I don't know, and I still don't know today, the competing fiscal priorities the Chancellor would have had and the many, many things that would have been on his plate. But this was all that I cared about at that moment in time. And those vulnerable and disadvantaged claimants were who I cared about. And they were my priority, and that's why I sent the message.
Leaving aside the fiscal and political choices that are involved in whether or not to extend or not, had there actually been any analysis conducted by the Department or the Treasury of the success of the uplift as against its original objectives? I mean, you can point to success in the sense that it was stood up very quickly and the money got out the door very quickly, but in terms of the extent to which it actually did what it had been intended to do, was any analysis done of that?
So all the analysis that I'm aware of, I think is exhibited in my witness statement. Although in terms of the original policy intent, it's probably more Treasury that would be the better department to conduct such analysis. The Department for Work and Pensions continued with their analysis of poverty and the impact on household income, and the universal credit uplift clearly played a part in that. That's how we knew the impact that it had had on poverty rates and figures. But I don't know what particular work was done within the Treasury in terms of analysis against their original policy intent.
And against that original objective of cushioning the blow for those who'd lost their jobs or income in the pandemic. Okay, thank you. Can I move on then to the third limb of the questions on the extension, which is the continued exclusion of legacy benefits. Now, you told us earlier today that so far as you're concerned, it was this operational problem was the block, operational reasons that just meant you risk crashing the system. It would take a year potentially to arrange this. But a year had now passed. Now, accepting that the original policy had been for a year's uplift, so it might have been expected it would end, we've just seen that debates about extending it had been rumbling on for many months. Was anything being done in the department during that year to see whether the operational problems could have been overcome to extend the support to legacy recipients?
Well, certainly the one-off payment option, as we discussed earlier, was considered and discounted. But in terms of the annual uprating, a decision would have been needed several months in advance of that in order to uprate legacy benefits. And again, that decision could only really have come from the Treasury, notwithstanding largely because of the financial cost, but also because that decision would have had to have been taken. And again, Neil Calling is the better one to be able to answer this question, but my understanding would be at least 7 or 8 months out from the point of uprating.
So if it took about 5 months to programme the numbers in any way annually, to uprate from April 2021, you'd have had to be having a firm decision by September, October of 2020.
I think at the very latest, that's my understanding. And I think the fact that the decision was made so late, in fact, I can't remember the exact date you said, but I think it was as late as February of 2021. There was not a chance at that point that it could have been uprated in the same way. It would have. I think it probably would have needed to have taken place in the summer of 2020.
So is your position then, if you discount the idea of one-off payments, then the operational block remained unless the decision had been taken much, much earlier?
Yes, but at the same time, again, going back to the sort of conversation we had or subject we had much earlier, we were still alive to the fact that there were people who did not benefit from the UC uplift that needed additional support. And through the COVID Winter Grant Scheme and the Household Support Fund, we were pushing for significant sums of money to go into local welfare assistance. And that came off the back of discussions, meetings with stakeholders like the Trussell Trust and others. Emma Revie, the chief exec there, and I discussed local welfare assistance scheme right at the beginning. So we were working on other measures outside of the uplift that would support those who weren't necessarily eligible for the uplift.
Thank you. Can I move on then to the end of the uplift in October 2021? So this is the penultimate issue on the uplift. All that's left after this is monitoring and evaluation. And when I've asked you about that, we've got easements, long COVID and reflections. So I think we're making reasonable time, just so you know. There is an end in sight. So the end of the uplift. We know it ended in October 2021. We also know that you had left the department on the 16th of September 2021. And so you weren't involved in the moment at which it ended. But is this the position really that in effect it wasn't a decision to end the uplift, it was rather that no decision to extend it was taken? Again, because it was going to end, it was always temporary.
Yes, I've sort of covered this in my witness statement in that the Treasury view on this, I think, was very different from the department's view, because as far as the Treasury were concerned, their policy position was we've extended the uplift for 6 months and it will end on this date, subject to us deciding something different, as in making a further positive decision. Whereas the department would have had to have taken steps, system-wise, coding-wise, to remove the uplift. So it was a positive decision. I wouldn't say it's positive, but you take my point. That a decision to start removing the uplift from the system. So we saw it differently to the Treasury, but you're absolutely right. It would have required another decision, a fresh decision to extend, because we wouldn't have had the money. Frankly, we wouldn't have had the several billions of pounds needed to extend it further.
Do you think that as it developed, really, that the gap between the Treasury and the Department of Work and Pensions grew in terms of how the uplift was viewed? By which I mean that the Treasury introduced it as a temporary measure to cushion the blow of those who'd lost their jobs. The department signed up to that, but also saw the wider benefit of getting more money to people generally. And as the uplift continued, from the department's perspective, it became, as you told us earlier, more and more about actually helping people in poverty and trying to alleviate hardship. But the Treasury's position had remained fixed with why it had been introduced in the first place, which was to cushion the blow of the pandemic.
I can't really speak to that, only because it's only the Secretary of State that would have been in those meetings with the Prime Minister and the Chancellor. Having said that, my approach was very much at that point, certainly from the spring onwards, that the compelling reasons for retaining the uplift were its wider impact on society and poverty, and they were very much a lot of the work that we were commissioning as by way of evidence and presenting to Number 10 and the Treasury as a positive argument for retaining it in perpetuity. But I can't say what the view of Number 10, the Treasury, or indeed the Secretary of State is, because I know she was arguing for it and presenting the information that we were putting forward. But I'm also aware the Chancellor would have had many competing fiscal priorities, and where we were asking for several £billion more year on year.
In perpetuity.
In perpetuity,
yeah.
Quite.
Okay. You were leaving the department, but you tell us in your statement that you had the unhappy task of being responsible for communications around the fact it was going to end. Don't really want to dwell on those, but looking back, do you think that the department made it clear enough from the start that this was always going to be temporary, so that the messaging was clear enough at the outset that, in other words, don't come to rely on this as a long-term uprating?
It's a really good question, and I think if we'd have had the time and the system capacity at the time to be able to actually separate out the £20 as a separate amount, if you like, on your UC account, that would have clearly been preferable. So people could see it was a temporary uplift. We didn't have the time or the scope or the bandwidth or capacity to do that at the time. And also, frankly, having spoken with numerous benefit claimants on visiting job centres, but also those organisations and stakeholders who support claimants, it probably wouldn't have been noticed in any event. I'm making a claim. What am I entitled to? You're not really thinking about what's your child element, what's your housing element, what's your standard allowance. You're just thinking, well, what am I going to get at the end of this month, and what can I afford? So I think we could, with more time and resource and capacity, have done more to separate out that additional payment to make it really clear. Whether it would have been enough or noticed, I don't know. But I do know that there was significant media coverage at the time, including the Chancellor's statement, which did make it clear it was a temporary uplift to the UC payment.
Thank you. So moving on to the last topic then, monitoring and evaluation. And I have asked you already a couple of questions about this, because I asked you when you were talking about the extension, whether you've got any analysis of whether it had hit its intended beneficiaries. During the time that the uplift was in place, did you receive any analysis of how well it was assisting those it was intended to assist, or any evaluation in real time of how it was landing?
So not as I recall, other than the regular meetings and calls with stakeholders and others across the DWP, who would be feeding back on the impact it was having at a grassroots level with individuals and families. And I found that those interactions with the charities and voluntary organisations hugely valuable in terms of being able to feed back in to the Secretary of State, to the system, what was and wasn't working.
Okay, thank you. Can I move on then to the fourth overall topic, fraud and error from easements, please? So we understand easements to be effectively a relaxation of the process by which claims are made and assessed. Many of those taken due to the public health risks that were pertaining at the time. So in other words, face-to-face meetings became impossible and so on and so forth. The Secretary of State made the decisions, is that right?
That's right, yes.
But you obviously fed your views into her. Did you consider that this was a sensible approach to introduce these easements, to get money to the people who needed them?
It's not so much whether it was sensible, it's whether it was essential. And I find this topic really difficult because it pains me every penny that we lost to fraud during COVID, and every penny in that system that doesn't go to vulnerable claimants and disadvantaged groups and is lying in the pocket of some serious organised crime organisation is deeply regrettable. But we're presented with an almost impossible choice, and that was that the system as it stood, because of the epidemiological conditions and the situation in terms of closing job centres, couldn't continue as it was. And we were presented with a clear choice, and officials made it really clear to us that the system would not be able to cope unless these easements were introduced. And we did that in the knowledge that we would be, frustratingly, regrettably, opening the door to fraudsters. And there are two types of fraud. There's individual fraud, and that's an individual claimant who might say they've got more children than they actually have, or overinflate their rental figure, or say they don't have any savings when they've actually got significant amounts of capital. That was a problem, but those figures are often recoverable through checks later on. The element that really concerned me, and there are numerous responses and documents in the witness statement backwards and forwards between my private office and officials, was the serious and organised crime element that it's appalling, but they actively targeted our benefit system, knowing that we had to put those easements in place to make sure that claimants got paid in full and on time. And I think the difficult thing is, and I often think about this, and I was thinking ahead about the questions you might ask me, you've got to then also think about the counterfactual. And presented with Neil Cooling and others who were really clear, if you don't introduce these easements, this system is going to fall over. And that means claimants aren't going to be paid, they're not going to make their rent, they're not going to make their payments. And on that basis, the counterfactual would have been that ministers would have ignored that advice, the system fell over, claimants weren't paid. I think we'd be having a very different hearing here today. And Lady, you'd rightly be hauling me over the coals as a minister for not following the clear advice of officials. But deeply regrettable that money was lost to fraud.
So if you accept that from an operational perspective that had to happen, otherwise the system would fall over, I think you did express concerns that having taken those decisions, the department was not really being proactive enough about reviewing claims and doing what it could after the easements have been applied to identify cases of fraud. Is that fair?
I think that is fair. And
well, can I just put up an email to
yes,
help you with this?
I think I know the email you're referring to.
Your view about it is
Yeah.
INQ 000 655 624, please. So we have the email from the at the bottom there to you. Hi, Will, please find attached a box note. Proposal is for the team to review 13,500 claims which have the closest direct link to a hijack ID claim for a 2-week period. And then, would you like to give a firm steer? And then your reply is at the top.
Yes, I mean...
I'm surprised it hasn't started already. So were you frustrated that there didn't seem to be enough urgency about this?
That was, again, somewhat more robust than my usual style. I'm not proud of that email either, but I was getting frustrated by it, but I'm not going to criticise DWP officials because we were asking them to do the near on impossible. They were under huge pressure, but I was just growing increasingly concerned about fraud and making sure that we were doing all we could to mitigate it and minimise it. And it did get to the point, actually, with some of our fraud operations. Lady, I don't think I'm at liberty to even go into the names of them, let alone, because I think some may even still be ongoing. But we were meeting daily and then weekly, and I was feeding back, as you'll see, milady, from the weekly notes to the Secretary of State on the action resulting from those fraud activities. So I'm not going to criticise officials. That email is probably more curt than I would have ordinarily sent, but I was getting frustrated because I needed the department to have the same sense of urgency as I felt, that this was taxpayers' money that should be going to claimants, that is going to some pretty awful people.
Thank you. Just picking up on one discrete area, I think it was identified there was a problem between cross-checking whether people had applied for universal credit and self-employed income support because they were administered completely separately. Can you, looking forwards, think of any solution to that or any measure that could have been put in place earlier?
So I mean, I don't recall that particular situation, but I think we towards the last few months of my time at the Department for Work and Pensions, working with the Cabinet Office, I was increasingly seeking, and I think actually the government now is bringing forward legislation to do this, to actually have more ability and visibility cross-government of what's happening. And we were looking at HMRC and bank data to be able to say, well, if somebody, and this is more on the individual side than the serious organised fraud side, that if someone's making a claim, the system across government should really be able to identify if you're holding the data in a different government department, whether that's true or not. So I think the more data sharing there can be within all the usual guidelines and safety and everything else, and GDPR, to ensure that claims are accurate, because some of these are it's error, it's not fraud, it's a mistake. They didn't realise the question, and be fair to people. But the better the data sharing across government, the more you can minimise the error and, dare I say, a bit of the fraud as well.
Thank you. Can I move on then to the fifth and penultimate topic, Mr. Quince? That is the consideration of long COVID by the Department of Work and Pensions. Now, obviously at the start of the uplift, March 2020, we can proceed, I think, on the basis that you weren't factoring in long COVID because it wasn't a condition that you knew about at that time. Was there any factoring in of the potential for long-term conditions at that time that you're aware of?
To my knowledge, no, but it probably wouldn't have come across my desk or fallen within my remit in any event, because although I had responsibility for the system and therefore the payments, any particular condition and the interaction and relationship with stakeholders would have been the Minister for Disabled People and the Secretary of State. So I wouldn't have expected to have been cited on that, and nor would I have any visibility of any interaction with particular conditions, given that the system, and my understanding is it's not my area of expertise, but it's all based on capability as opposed to specific conditions. And if somebody with suffering from long COVID was eligible, they would have been eligible. But I don't recall any specific reference to long COVID during my time in the department towards the latter months of me being there.
Looking ahead, now that long COVID is a recognised condition and people do know what long COVID is, or some people do know what long COVID is, and this really goes to the point of the question, do you think it would be a good idea going forwards for job centre staff, those responsible for assessing claims, to have training in long-term conditions like long COVID so that they can identify the difficulties and take that into account when making decisions about eligibility?
It's a fair question, just not one I feel qualified, ever having held the disability brief or interaction with the way work capability assessments are made. Instinctively, the answer's got to be yes, hasn't it? I mean, the more informed those making assessments are about individual conditions and how they may affect somebody's capability and their potential interaction with the labour market, that's got to be, instinctively, that just feels like it's got to be beneficial. But I'm afraid I'm not really qualified to give any more than just that instinctive response.
Okay, thank you. And so can we turn then to the final section of questioning, which is looking forwards now. Having been the Minister in the DWP at the time, having learned what you've learned, knowing how the department operates, looking ahead to a future civil emergency, and you've done some thinking about this in your statement. I really want to pick up on that. You say at, I think it's paragraph 117 of your statement, it would help to identify off-the-shelf options for economic interventions. Could you just expand on your thinking on that?
Yes. So I think in effect, and again, I wasn't to quote Hamilton in the room where it happened, if you like, but on when the UC uplift policy was designed per se. But my understanding is it was this seems like a good thing to do. How would you operationalise it? And there was that backwards and forwards between the departments. I think having a suite of potential options that can be taken off the shelf for particular examples where the system we know has the capability and it can be operationalised, and by when, I think would give the information needed to both Treasury, Number 10 and the department to adapt to different situations, because, as I mentioned earlier, Milady, any pandemic, civil emergency could take very different forms. I've referenced in here a potential cyber threat. Well, in that case, universal credit could be a problem. And in this case, it was the fact we had to close job centres, so universal credit was a godsend. But I think having those off-the-shelf options, and I think the department had some, but in my experience, and I put this in my witness statement, they were largely based around their learnings and experience from the 2007-2008 financial crash, and the situation and the times were very different. People were very happy to go on their smartphone and meet a job coach, work coach. They don't need to go into a job centre to do that. Now that then has implications for the number of work coaches that you need, the number of offices you need to rent, for example. And that's just one response and not an immediate one to a pandemic. But the point being, the more you've thought about these things and the more tools you have that you can just take off a shelf and say, that might need a little bit of adjustment, but that's going to fit this scenario, and you know that the systems can deliver it, I think the better policy and decision-making in government ultimately would be.
Thank you. I undertook I would come back to this and give you an opportunity to expand on it, and so I will. That is the idea of a household data set that would enable targeting. What's your view about that, and how beneficial that would be in a future emergency of any kind?
I mean, I sort of come at this from the principle that the more data and real-time rich data that policy and decision makers have, the better informed those decisions are inevitably going to be. And the reason I stress real term is you can then pivot accordingly once you've assessed how well you're delivering against the original policy objectives. So that rich real-time data, I think, would be hugely beneficial.
It might be said in reply that everyone can always say that more data is a good thing, but what does that actually look like in reality? How, through the DWP, would that be collected? What would it mean?
Well, I mean, the department already does a really effective job on this when it comes to poverty. And it looks at the drivers of poverty and the different policies and modelling of how the impact of different policies. But I think the more information from Treasury, in real term, about what's happening in the labour market, about that real-time data, which would enable individual departments to pivot policy accordingly, I think could only be beneficial. I can't say what exactly it would look like, but just in my experience, the more data you have available to make your case, the better the policy ends up being.
Do you mean that it wouldn't look like waiting a year for the ONS to publish
Correct.
hard official statistics, but having that sort of plumbed-in ability to pick up live?
I think that could only be helpful.
Yeah.
It could only be
Okay.
helpful.
You've touched on this, the idea of backup to the IT capability and IT systems. So, as you said, if the system was taken out by a cyber attack, there'd be a need to do something different. So, does that factor into your earlier point about having a suite of options that are available depending on the nature of the emergency?
It does, and I think, again, to the department's credit, it has a really good balance between an online dynamic, agile system that anybody can access from home with a smartphone or computer or tablet, and the ability to make a phone call or go into a job centre or to go through help to claim or other services. I mean, I've been out of the department for quite some time now, and out of government and politics. So I don't know exactly where we are now, but I think just being very careful not to have a single point of failure. So making sure that there are options other than just a online application to universal credit, I think is really important.
And just one final area of reflection to get your view. I'm not going to ask you about what easements might look like in a future emergency, because we don't know what the future emergency would look like. But do you think generally that there ought to be better signposting at the time that easements are applied, if they're needed again, that there will be retrospective checks, there will be a system for scrutiny to deter fraudulent claims?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and one I've pondered myself for two reasons. I mean, the first is I don't think the public need to be reminded not to commit fraud to not commit fraud. I don't think most people fill out their universal claim thinking, how can I game or rig the system? That's the first point. And then secondly, there's a wider point about the individuals committing error or fraud often can be adjusted and retrospectively dealt with by identifying where something hasn't been filled in correctly. Let's just say, for argument's sake, that it was an error. That can be addressed later on, especially if somebody's still within the universal credit system. The worry that the department always had, because I wanted us to talk about fraud more, I wanted this to be a sort of national endeavour, that the public really got behind us and helped to tackle the fraud challenge. The department was always really concerned about the more you talk about it, the more you're identifying the vulnerabilities of the system. And if you remind through boxes and other things on the UC system, actually that wouldn't have been deliverable in time at the earliest part of the pandemic anyway, but so park that for a moment. But the more you highlight the vulnerability of the system, the more you open the doors to the serious and organised crime element. And frankly, as officials told me, that's the money you're sadly never going to see again.
Okay, thank you very much. Those are my questions. I think, my lady, there are some
There are.
Rule 10 questions.
Although I don't know whether Mr. Prince can answer your questions, Mr. Verkumeran, but please have a go. In light of some of the answers he's given is what I mean.
Yes, indeed. And in fact, my lady, I was going to address you on that. As I think you've noted, I was granted permission on questions which he has slightly addressed. But if I may ask a follow-up question instead about how he came not to be informed about the Long COVID Oversight Board and Long COVID by the time he had left, or in the time preceding his departure from his role.
All right, long as you can take it shortly. Thank you.
I can indeed. Now, Mr. Quince, we understand that you weren't informed or aware of Long COVID by September 2021 when you left your post. Is that right?
Well, to be clear, I mean, aware of long COVID. I mean, I suspect and I can't recall, but I would have been aware of the existence of long COVID potentially. I can't say that for sure, but I was thinking in more a ministerial capacity that I don't recall it ever coming to my attention as being a factor in terms of the universal credit system. So it didn't come into any submissions, for example, as I recall.
And what we are aware of is that there was a Long COVID Oversight Board meeting on the 22nd of June 2021. DWP was invited, and DHSC, which hosted the board meeting, noted that long COVID had potential for wider socioeconomic impacts and that there was a need for a robust and coordinated approach across government. Now, from what you've said, you weren't informed in any submissions. Can we take it that you weren't informed any of the Long COVID Oversight Board or those wider socioeconomic impacts of long COVID?
My recollection, lady, is no, but I think for context, given what the learned lady's just said, I think it would have been the Minister for Employment, Mims Davis, and the Minister for Disabled People, Justin Tomlinson, that would have been cited on that and not me. I think it's unlikely that would have come to my attention.
But in respect of how you would consider how people with long COVID who are applying for universal credit might be affected, can you say that it didn't come across your desk? Was that a failing in respect of your officials or coordination with the Minister for Disabled People? Can you explain that?
Neither. So in terms of I sort of explained a little bit earlier, the process for claims, I had responsibility for the system, but the work capability assessments and the disability elements were covered by the Minister for Disabled People. So he would have had the focus on that area. I did not have responsibility, for example, the assessors or the assessment process or system. That would have fallen under both the Secretary of State and the Minister for Disabled People.
Just a final question on that. You did have responsibility for the Help to Claim scheme, didn't you?
Correct.
And so that would have been one mechanism in which you could have been involved in providing further information about long COVID for people who are trying to access benefits claims. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, that's a fair point. And I think just for context, the Help for Claim, which was run by Citizens Advice, I held the relationship with Citizens Advice, and my role was to hold them to account for the contract, if you like, that we had with them to provide the Help to Claim service. But but you're probably delving into minutiae that I wouldn't have got into with Help to Claim at a national level. My meetings with them were very high level with the chief executive, and it was about the contract and the way it was being delivered at an individual Job Centre Plus level. I also had those meetings alongside the Minister for Disabled People, and it was really important that he was there representing the voice of disabled people in that process.
Thank you very much. Ms Smythe.
My lady, the inquiry has already asked.
I can't. Are you switched on?
Of course not. Counsel to the inquiry has already asked our question, but could I have permission to ask a brief follow-up question, which is in relation to whether Mr Quince was aware of the department having considered a possible alternative, and it's in the light of the answer that he gave.
Very well. I'm going to start clamping down on follow-ups. I appreciate I've allowed a couple, 2 or 3 today, so carry on, Ms Smythe.
Thank you, my lady. So, Mr Quince, you've accepted that one of the key policy rationales of the benefit cap was to encourage claimants to look for work, and that ability was seriously curtailed during the pandemic. And you've also said that suspending the benefit cap entirely would have required primary legislation and that it would have posed operational challenges. Now, you may not be able to help with this question, but are you able to say whether the department considered any other measures which could have been implemented through secondary legislation and which would have reduced the number of people subject to the cap or increased the number of people who are exempt from it? So an example might be reducing the amount that households had to be earning to be exempt from the cap, whether currently or historically, or increasing the grace period. And of course, if you can't help with that, just say.
Yes, I mean, lady, I can't help that. I haven't even had sight of the Minister for Employment, Mims Davies' witness statement. But I would have thought either that witness statement or the Secretary of State, former Secretary of State, might be able to help in that regard.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Smythe. Ms Beattie. Ms Beattie's just there.
Mr Quince, I ask questions on behalf of National Disabled People's Organisations. In a letter of the 30th of March 2021 from your colleague in the Department for Work and Pensions, the Minister for Employment, Mims Davies, MP, to Child Poverty Action Group and other children's groups, it was stated that neither the Department for Work and Pensions nor HMRC can advise individual claimants whether they would be better off moving to universal credit or remaining on legacy benefits. Is it correct that throughout the pandemic, DWP and the government were not in a position to advise individual claimants about moving to universal credit, including whether they might be worse off and lose entitlements which they would then not be able to recover?
Yes, I'm trying to recall exactly. I mean, my understanding was the department signposted individuals to a benefits calculator or claim checker, where people could check whether they would be better or worse off by switching from legacy benefits or working tax credits onto universal credit. Because you're right, there were people who would have been worse off or lost their entitlement altogether. That concerned me greatly, and I worked with Neil Cooling and others in the department to introduce a checkbox into the system just to make sure that people had checked in advance. We can't do it for them, but to check in advance that this is definitely the right decision for them, because you can't go back to working tax credits, for example. And I don't recall exactly. I know that checkbox was introduced, and it was direct response to, I suspect, some of the organisations you represent and others who made this point to us. Would I have liked it to have happened faster? Yes, of course I would. But it was a system design that had to be built into the system. But we did recognise it and we did put that in place.
And just to be clear, that benefits calculator is something online, is that right?
I'm trying to. I think so. I'm trying to. I think there are several online, including through disability rights organisations that provide such calculators, but it's a long time. Sorry.
Now, Her Ladyship's report last week obviously found that digital exclusion was a matter that greatly affected disabled people. Would it be right that then would maybe not have been really an accessible option for disabled people during the pandemic to use an online calculator?
the online calculator. I mean, but potentially not. But there were other organisations that I know stood ready to support people, including the department had phone lines open, Help to Claim was open. A number of charities and organisations were still supporting claimants that were had issues with using technology. But in terms of a future pandemic, should that be something that should be explored? I don't see why not. I think that sounds like a sensible proposal.
I'm grateful. In your statement, you say that there were measures taken, in your view, to ensure that those on legacy benefits were not overlooked in relation to the comparison to the universal credit uplift. And you mention in that regard that legacy benefits were increased through annual uprating by £600 million from April 2020 and a further £100 million from April 2021. It's the position, isn't it, that sort of quite apart from any issue concerning the uplift to universal credit, that annual uprating is a regular occurrence aimed at keeping benefits in line with inflation and not a specific pandemic support measure. That's right, isn't it?
That's correct, yes.
And again, just to be clear, that $600 million that you mentioned from April 2020, you've explained that things have to be laid in place sometime in advance, and is that through a statutory instrument that's done?
So yes, through the statutory instrument, but in terms of the legacy benefit systems, it's more, I think, the coding behind the scenes that actually make it happen.
And so that $600 million from April 2020 had actually been set in place, I think, at least by January 2020,
yes.
Before the pandemic even really got going at all, let alone before its impact was felt. Is that correct?
I think so, yes. Yeah.
So it wasn't in itself a measure taken to ensure those on legacy benefits were not overlooked in relation to the pandemic. It was just part of an annual exercise that had happened even before the pandemic. Is that right?
In terms of the uprating, yes, the 600 million and the 100 million were part of an annual uprating exercise and process.
And finally, you refer in your witness statement to laying a lot of importance on engagement with charities and organisations supporting vulnerable claimants, and you set out details of some meetings and contact that you had with charities and organisations representing vulnerable people. We don't see there any consultation or meetings with disabled people's organisations, namely organisations that are majority-led, directed, governed and staffed by disabled people. Do you agree that there is benefit in engaging with such organisations, both to identify who needs support and to help and implement measures to get that support out effectively?
It's a really fair question, and the way governments have always worked and government departments have worked is specific ministers will meet stakeholders and organisations that represent groups that within their specific remit. So as a result, the organisations you rightly reference would have met with the Minister for Disabled People, and actually a lot of the groups that I met and listed, and I suspect there were more, but these are the only ones I could find in a relatively short period of time, did representing disabled people as well as part of their broader remit. But of course, behind the scenes, I would have been talking with the Minister for Disabled People, the Minister for Employment, and indeed the Secretary of State. We didn't work entirely in silos, but just from a sort of logistics perspective and also just a capacity perspective, we would inevitably meet with stakeholders and groups that best fit within our particular departmental responsibility. But inevitably you talk and you cross over, and there were meetings, for example, with Macmillan that I attended with the Minister for Disabled People.
Thank you, Melody.
Thank you very much, Ms Beattie. That completes the questions we have for you, Mr Quince. I'm extremely grateful to you. It's probably been a long afternoon for you, but put it this way, some former ministers have had to put up with rather more demands from the inquiry. So thank you very much indeed for your help. Very grateful to you. And in putting together the witness statement, which obviously I'll also read in case anything occurs to you on the way home. Don't forget, I will be taking into account the written material. Thank you for your help. I think that completes, say, for one matter about a restriction order.
Yes, please, my lady. Could we seek your permission, please, for a restriction order to redact the name of a junior official that was named during the course of the evidence this afternoon from both the transcript and the YouTube video?
Very well. So be it. Thank you very much. I shall return for a 10 o'clock start tomorrow.
All rise.